Hello again. Last week we ended off in verse 16. We're going to pick up, I'm going to start reading in verse 16 just as a contextual point so that we remember where we were at last week. Malachi 3, verse 16 is where we're going to start. Then those who fear the Eternal One consulted each other about God's charges, each one to his neighbor. The Eternal One paid attention and he heard. A book of remembrance was written before him for those who honored the Eternal and valued his name and the good reputation. And remember last week we looked at how for the first part of Malachi, God's come before the priest and the people are watching. And God is telling the priest and the people, hey, I am your God. I have taken care of you. And over and again, they've said, well, how are you doing that? How have you ever loved us? How have you taken care of us? How have you done this? How have you done that? Kind of insinuating that they've done it all on their own and that God has really not kept his end of the bargain, not kept his end of the covenant, to put it in their terms and to put it properly for us. After all these verses in chapter 1 and 2 and all the way through the first part of 3, we see people who feared God, who were really trying to follow him. And I don't mean fear like cowering in the corner. We're talking about fear here means respect. Fear means reverence. And reverence doesn't mean cowering in a corner. Reverence means you understand that God is more than us. God is God and we are not. And that's a healthy understanding, that we understand the Creator is the Creator. We are not the Creator. That kind of distinction. But these people who follow God faithfully, who may have, they're a part of this whole group for sure. But they still, even though they might have faltered, we're not talking about a group here, okay, this is the only part of all the Israelites here who haven't disobeyed, that haven't grumbled, because remember now, these are people that came back from captivity. And we're not talking about locked in cages captivity. They were brought against their will from Israel and settled over in Babylon. A long ways. Babylon is Babylon from Israel would be like where Iraq is at today. That's Babylon. That area there, going up into the northern part even of Iraq, that's Babylon. And they were taken captive to there, and just some, not all of them, some came back to Israel and rebuilt. Under Ezra, they built the temple. Under Nehemiah, they built the walls of the city. During that time, they're building up their own houses now. And yes, the king at the time, he gave them money. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the Medo-Persian king, Darius. And so the people that remember God, that they haven't totally abandoned God. Like when we were looking at these first people here, the priest and everything, they were just like, yeah, we're going through the motions, whatever. And it was nearly like they had abandoned God. But the people that have kept faith, they're together. They're coming together here in verse 16. God sees, because we hear right here in the second part of verse 16, and the Eternal One paid attention and he heard. God's paying attention, because God's paying attention to these other people too that are like, hey, you don't know what you're doing, God. You haven't kept your end of the bargain. You're just a shoddy God. You're just, we could worship anybody else and be fine. That kind of attitude. That's what God's gotten so far in Malachi. But now we see a group of people saying, whoa, whoa. They don't, I think what's happening too is that this group is like, they've been paying attention to this conversation and they're like, I'm not telling God that I could do a better job than him. I'm not going to do that. I'm not comfortable with that. That doesn't sound like there's any good thing in there for us. And so they come together because they want to be represented that, no, we're not like these other people. And in verse 17, then, we see God saying, and they will be mine on that day when I, the eternal commander of heavenly armies, make my unique treasure, which is the kingdom of Israel. I will have pity on them as a man has pity on his son who serves him. And you will return and notice the difference between the righteous and the wicked, between those serving God and between those not serving him. And so now we have this massive transition here. And that's why I wanted to start in 16, because it's so important that we get that the people there was people that made a choice in the midst of all this crazy, the midst of all this people saying, God, you're not fulfilling your contract, your covenant with us. They say, whoa, whoa, whoa. After we've heard all this, we're not in on this. We're not saying that. We stood here this whole time and didn't say anything, but now we're standing up and saying, that's not us. And so God says, verse 17 again, and verse 18, you will return and notice the difference between the righteous and the wicked, between those serving God and those not serving him. So God has been there right in the midst this whole time. And he says, I noticed. Yeah, you stood there initially. But then you stood up and said, that's not us. And he said, I noticed between those who were serving me and those who were not. He's saying it in the context that other people would, but really he's trying to, well, not really, I don't want to make a distinction like that. What he's telling the people that have stood up now is, I noticed. I have been standing here in your midst just like when I was speaking to you and you just stood there and let it all happen. I'm still here, and I noticed that you stood up. I noticed that there's a difference between you who really want to serve me and those not. Because the people would not have control over the priest at all. The priest in the temple, They'd be doing their thing, and the people would not have control over them. And so if they come and the priest offer what they give the priest, because the people don't offer, the priest offers, if the priest offers in an ungodly way what the people have offered, there isn't a lot that the person can do about what the priest has done with the offering that the person has brought as an offering. But God is saying that there's a difference and that he notices. Verse 18 ends chapter 3. When we get into chapter 4, it's an entirely different. We've really turned a page, and I'm going to save that for next time. But I want to stop here and say that if you find yourself looking around and saying, wow, maybe you look around and I'm not saying the church that you attend, the local body of believers that you are necessarily a part of, but maybe you say, hey, as a whole, like we live in the United States, and you look around at the church in the United States and go, have we lost our mind as the church? Why are we not standing up and saying no to this? Why are we not speaking out on this? Why are we laying there like a dead fish? Or maybe you look at the church and say, hey, you know what's happening with the church is that they're just like those priests in the start of Malachi. They're telling God, you do your part finally, and then we'll think about ours. Whatever the case may be, if your heart is heavy because you look around and you don't see Christians, let's just say you look around and you don't see people in general standing up for God, saying that I am the Lord's. And you don't have to stand up on a soapbox and tell people that they're bad to be recognized as God's people. That's not how that goes. But your heart is burning to stand up for God. That's these people finally like, I'm standing up. God is telling these people, and I believe he's telling us, that he will notice when we stand up for him. So this week, that's our call from this study, is stand up for God. I know there's times where you don't feel like it. I know there's times where you may not be feeling good. All kinds of different things. But there's a million different ways that we can stand up for God. And I'm encouraging you, stand up.